So welcome to The Conduit. I am completely thrilled. The timing of this is either fortuitous or tragic, depending on your perspective, or perhaps both. But to have your insights on both the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and now the more spreading regional conflict is really, really important. So Karen has given the introduction of what you've done in your life, so I'm not going to go through that resume again. I'm going to dive right in, if I may. You and your co-author describe the current impasse between Israel and the Palestinians as 30 years of a failure of imagination and the result of a con or a gimmick in the form of the two-state solution. So I think that it would be very useful if you kind of expanded on that central assertion, which is a kind of core part of this really remarkable book.
So first, thanks all of you for being here. Thanks for the Conduit for inviting me. You're right, it is. I was expecting that we would only talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's enough to say and to lament and to be depressed about, but now we have a war in Iran, and I'm sure we'll find some time to talk about that. So, I mean, there's so many answers I could give to your question. Hopefully you'll read the book and you get the full answer. At its heart, I'd say there's several themes. One theme is that if after 30 years of this peace process, let's call it for use the name that it's been given, that we ended up with October 7th and with the slaughter that followed, then something went tragically wrong. And if it went that tragically wrong, our contention is that it's not just that the negotiations were, there were mistakes made in the negotiations, it's that the conflict was misdiagnosed. And if the conflict is misdiagnosed, you can't resolve it. And the two-state solution at some point, and I don't want to claim that all the people who were fighting for the two-state solution knew that it was a hoax at the time that they were fighting for it. Hussein and I were among the ones who believed in it. But at some point, and perhaps it was never possible, but certainly at some point, all it became was a gimmick that people invoked in order to pretend that they were doing something, knowing full well that even as they spoke those words, everything on the ground was moving exactly in the opposite direction of the goal that they claimed that they were working for. And to this day, you hear people talk about a two-state solution, and they say it because they have nothing better to say, and because they have nothing that they want to do, that they could do to try to improve the situation on the ground. And so they speak about a two-state solution as giving them sort of the justification or the validation to do nothing else.
So if that idea persisted for so long, with so many people who were so intelligent and well-informed, and if so many of these negotiations revolved around it, why did such a flawed idea persist? What was it that allowed it to endure?
Well, first, it did have, again, as we explain in the book, this is a concept that has a foreign pedigree. It's not an originally Zionist or Palestinian idea. As partition, the idea of partition actually maybe comes from this country, but regardless, it's an idea that has been sort of projected by the notion of division in ethno-national states, is a more Western Eurocentric idea that has been, projected onto the actors in the region. And it has a certain logic. It has a Cartesian logic, if you will, and we describe it. Two people are fighting for the same land. What better than to divide it, right? And to say we're going to take a line, draw the line on the map. One side gets this, the other side gets that. Jerusalem will divide, and then we'll call it quits. We'll call it a peace. It has a degree of international legitimacy, and I think many people are afraid of giving it up for fear of what it means. If you give up the two-state solution, what do we have? We have nothing, right? And when I've said this to some European officials, they will say, if you give up the two-state solution, you're giving carte blanche to those in Israel who want one state. As if they needed that carte blanche. It's sort of, or they say, if we give up the two-state solution, we're going to give up all hope. As if Israelis and Palestinians today, those who want peace, really have hope based on the mantra of the two-state solution. But I do understand that appeal. And so it survives because of the lack of imagination, of courage, of thinking of something else, and because there are interests that have been built around the perpetuation of the pursuit of two states, which is very different from the achievement of two states.
Okay, so and you use the terms sort of the drawing lines in a map of taking out and saying, well, this is your territory and this is our territory and this is how we're going to deal with the question of the settlements and this is how we're going to do land swaps and this is how we're going to deal with holy sites and all this sort of deep constitutional architecture. And basically your book argues that that approach failed for reasons that the parties weren't able to achieve it, or the more powerful party was unwilling to achieve it. But what you posit as an alternative is an approach which sort of tracks back to the roots of the conflict, something that I know a little bit about, which is a reckoning with the past and some kind of truth and justice or a reconciliation process, some deeper, some more fundamental process that needs to happen, which goes either alongside or precedes the more technocratic constitutional process. So tell us a little bit about the logic of that.
Yeah, and I was a negotiator, and so I was at the table where we were trying to draw these lines on the map, and where we really thought, this is what it will take to resolve the conflict. And when Hussein and I were involved in different ways in the negotiations, and people would come to us and say, you're dealing with the conflict that was born in 1967. You're talking about dividing the land. You're talking about drawing a line in Jerusalem. But what about what we hear from the parties that they care about? What about the refugees? What about the Nakba? What about the settlements? What about history? What about the emotions? And our answer at the time was, those are good questions. Let's first resolve the conflict, and then we'll deal with them. Which, in hindsight, makes no sense because that's what the conflict was about. So you can't resolve the conflict by ignoring the genesis of the conflict. And the fact is, there was a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians before 1967. There was a conflict at least since 1948. I would argue it started before then. But regardless, this is not a conflict just about how does Israel withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza. So there's so much more to this, and I think there was an attempt, there was an attempt to say, let's brush away that history and those emotions and the fears and the yearnings that are behind the conflict, resolve the conflict, and then we could address those. And so, and you and I were talking about this earlier, our view is not, well, let's have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission now to deal with all those narrative issues, and then we'll talk about what the solution is. It's that the solution itself has to try to be more responsive to those deep fears and aspirations that both sides have, which again are not related to what part of the West Bank is going to be settled or is going to be annexed by Israel, what part of the West Bank is going to be a sovereign Palestinian state. That's not what people haven't been motivated by that. When's the last time you've seen Israelis or Palestinians demonstrate, be willing to kill or die for a different line on the West Bank, or for different security arrangements, or for a different division of Jerusalem? That's not what is motivating the conflict. And so, yes, we would like to think this is the way to handle it. But we're not automatons. We're not artificial intelligence agents who just respond to these prompts. What makes people is what their emotions, and what has driven the Palestinian national movement is at a minimum a history of dispossession, of exile, of destruction, of liquidation of their leadership, and they want a solution that responds to that. And what's driven the Zionist movement is also a history of persecution and the Holocaust and pogroms and the fears that are associated with that. So you're right, there's some people who are, the more powerful party has other interests as well, but just in terms of if you look at the conflict between Jewish Israelis, the Zionist movement, and the Palestinians, it is so much deeper, it is so much more historical, it's so much more emotional than what we, the negotiators, were trying to do.
So I want to now introduce, I get that logic of there's a technocratic constitutional exercise that will distribute power between parties if they trust each other and have reconciled their differences enough to take the leap of faith. And you need to kind of do both, right? You need to sequence those two exercises, and one may be an impediment to the other, but you need both. Once you've got to a point where you have enough trust and resolution of the deep drivers of the conflict, you need a piece of paper which says, now what are we going to do? And you also need the trust in order to be able to finally sign off on it. So those two are in a dialectic with each other. I think the elephant in the room, and we were discussing it earlier, is really power. because the idea that you go through a process to build the trust and deal with the past, to then be able to put the technocratic solution into place, presupposes that one party who is infinitely more powerful than the other has an incentive, a desire, and a willingness to go through that process when the status quo kind of works for them. And so I'd love you to sort of just kind of introduce the third leg of the stool of technocratic maps, truth and reconciliation, and power into how you think about this.
Yeah, so first I'm going to say something. I would never claim that you first need to build trust between the parties. I don't think it's possible. I've said this, I've had so many discussions with Israelis who say, well, first we have to change the textbooks of the Palestinians, they need to accept us, and I say, okay, change the textbooks all you will. The first time a Palestinian is going to go through a checkpoint and is going to be treated the way they're treated, whatever trust you think you would have built by changing the textbook is going to be out the window. So living life is the lesson. It's not what you learn, and you're not going to build trust before you change the conditions under which Israelis and Palestinians coexist. So it's not about trust building, but just to sum up the prior answer is that whatever, and I'll come to your question about power, which is a critical one, whatever solution there's going to be, or whatever, don't even like the word solution, whatever arrangement there's going to be, at least for now, is going to have to take into account what is motivating, what is behind the conflict, and that means opening up, being more creative about solutions, and we could come to that. Are there different solutions that are not based on a strict ethno-national partition of the land? Yes, power. And of course, this is something that, again, it goes, we haven't spoken too much yet about the flailings and the disaster of U.S. mediation, but it is one thing that has been so striking about this setup, in which you have enormous asymmetry between two parties, and the powerful mediator, not just powerful, the most powerful mediator on earth, is siding with the more powerful of the two. So in terms of incentives, you're absolutely right. There is no logic to think that by putting the two sides at the table and telling them, here's a peace deal, go ahead and do it, that it could yield anything but a reflection of the asymmetry of power. And I remember this when I was working for President Obama. What I'm going to say, I think, is a good reflection of his analytic skills. It's also commentary on the political limitations that he felt he faced, and he probably did face, is at the end of his term, when a bunch of us were sitting around and he was going through, sort of looking at his track record in the Middle East, he said, all these people who are saying Israel is being irrational, Netanyahu is being irrational, he's driving Israel to a dead end where he's going to give up either the Jewish nature of the state or the democratic nature of the state. It's going to be a pariah. He said, there's nothing irrational in the way Israel is behaving. Israel is behaving the way any one of us would behave if there's no cost in perpetuating the status quo or even making it more to your advantage. What's irrational is those of us, I think he was not including himself, but those in the US who believe that simply because we're preaching to the Israelis, they're going to change course. Why should they? Because, to be candid, agreeing to a Palestinian state that has meaningful sovereignty, does present some risks to Israeli security. I don't think that that's too controversial to say it. I think it also could be a better outcome, but it is taking a gamble when, at this point, they feel like they have full dominance, full supremacy. So it is a cost, and if you're not facing any cost for continuing on your current path, nothing will change it. The real question is, A, whether the burdens of occupation and whatever forms of resistance that the Palestinian people will muster, and changes in the international climate, and maybe there are things happening in my own country that will change, who knows, we could come to that. Does that start changing the calculus? But otherwise, you're right. There's no reason why a trajectory that doesn't have any obstacle in front of it is not going to continue just the way it's proceeding.
So that then brings us to October 7th and the events that followed from that, and there's a series of breadcrumbs that then lead us into Iran and the conflict there and the recent conflagration. So you write in the book that October 7th wasn't a rupture or a discontinuity or a shock or surprise. In fact, it's the logical outcome, not a justifiable outcome, but a logical outcome of the nature of the conflict. It's an attempt by one party to either address the grievances of the past or alter power dynamics or a bit of both. And so what I'd love you to do is just do a little bit of, if the two-state solution was a mirage before October 7th, is it more or less of a mirage after October 7th? And the reaction to Israel's reaction to October 7th, which is the recognition of a Palestinian state, which by many, many countries, which seems to take us back to a two-state solution, which is less possible, arguably, after October 7th, sort of creates a kind of perfect storm of impossibilities. But tell us how you analyze October 7th in the context of your prior assertions.
So first, I mean, the reason Hussein and I, one of the reasons we decided to write the book was, as you say, after October 7th, we were hearing so many people saying, this is the work of, crazy fanatical Islamists on the one hand, and the response, the slaughter that followed, what a number of international organizations have now described as genocide, is the work of Prime Minister Netanyahu and his right-wing fanatical allies, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And our view was, that's easy, that's convenient, but it's also wrong. I mean, what Hamas did was more, quote-unquote, successful than many prior Palestinian attempts, but it wasn't fundamentally that different. Those of you, I'm sure, here who are familiar with Palestinian history know there have been many instances where the non-Islamist branch of the Palestinian National Movement tried to kidnap and to kill and to sow terror under their view, which is the only way Israel is going to move is if it has a taste of its own medicine. We have been terrified. They're going to be terrified. They've invaded our land. We're going to invade what they think is their land. We've been the captives. We're now going to be the captors. So there's as we say, October 7th was Palestinian through and through. And again, it's a very uncomfortable thing for some people to hear. But if you just look at even recent polling, and this is after the Palestinians have endured the outrage that they've been enduring for the last 2 years plus, there still is sizable, if not majority, sympathy, I'd say, for October 7th. But after October 7th, it was much greater. And on the Israeli side, this notion, it's just because we have this most right-wing government in Israel ever. I mean, again, the criticism of the Netanyahu government by public opinion was not they're going too far, that they weren't going far enough. So there was no feeling this is not us. This was not Bibi's war. This was Israel's war. And on both sides, the criticism when it emerged was not on moral, ethical grounds for the most part. On the Palestinian side, it was look at Israel's response. So as a strategic choice, it was a huge mistake what Hamas did, because they had a plan to provoke Israel, but no plan to deal with the obvious, inevitable response to the provocation. And on the Israeli side, when criticism started to manifest itself, it was less or not, look at what you're doing to the Palestinians, is what about the hostages? So that's where we say it is, and ultimately how Israelis and Palestinians dealt with one another on October 7th and after was of a page with how they have wanted to deal, deep down, they have wanted to deal with one another for a long time. Again, not necessarily the most comfortable thing to say, but I think it is pretty uncontentious, truly. Has it made two-state solution easier? I mean, I don't see how, in what universe. I mean, I guess you could still conjure up some scenario, but if if attempts to reach a two-state solution failed at a time when the U.S. was at the apex of its power, when you actually had something resembling a coherent national movement on the Palestinian side, you had Israelis who were more open, at least, and certainly when you had a settlement enterprise that was a fraction of what it is today. So even if the two-state solution was possible at some point, and I could go back and forth on that, maybe with a sturdier American hand, more pressure, it was possible. But today, does anyone truly believe that we could have a genuine two-state solution? I mean, you could have something that, since you're here, I'll call it a Bantustan kind of Palestinian state, I guess, but a true Palestinian state that feels sovereign, that is a meaningful sovereignty. I just don't see how that, show me the way we get from here to there. I'll be the first to sign on the page. I'm not anti-two-state solution. I may have an ethical preference for something else, but I'd be perfectly happy if that's what brings peace between Israelis and Palestinians. But I don't see what is the mechanism through which we're going to get from here to there given that everything, I mean, whether it's trust, if that's what we're going to call it, the topography on the ground, the state of the Palestinian movement, the state of Israeli politics, everything is pointing in a direction that is going the other way. So no, and that's where, when we speak about, in our book, and some people took offense, we said the two-state solution has become, it started as I forget what we said, an illusion, it becomes a delusion, and it grows into hoax, and then it becomes a big lie, is that when in the middle of October, of the Israeli response October 7th, U.S. officials under the Biden administration were saying the only solution is a two-state solution. Suddenly they remembered the two-state solution that they didn't really believe in, maybe with good reason before then. Now the only solution is two-state solution. We want an irreversible path to two-state solution. Did anyone in their right mind believe that they were saying it because they believed it was possible, or because they believed they needed to say it in order to placate those who thought they weren't doing anything? And same, frankly, with the recognition of Palestinian statehood that's occurred over recent months. Again, not the most comfortable thing to say, because I feel much more at ease with many of the people who supported the recognition than the people who opposed it. But truly, was Hussein and I wrote a piece at the time saying recognition is not going to make one bit of difference to the lives of any Israeli or certainly Palestinian on the ground. And it's going to give the people who recognize a Palestinian state sort of the good conscience. They've done their job. They've done what they needed to do, and now they could move on and do something else. That at a time when the slaughter was ongoing. So yes, that's why not only do we not, I would say we don't believe that it is realistic at this point, but the mere invocation of it for reasons that I just described is an insult to most people's intelligence.
So now let's move to the kind of from the kind of diagnostic part of your book to the ideation part in terms of possible solutions. And if you accept your analysis that a two-state solution, if it wasn't dead 10 years ago or 5 years ago, it's very, very difficult to imagine right now for all the reasons that you've intimated. We all want peace in that part of the world. We want a place where Israelis and Palestinians can coexist and live side by side, where there can be prosperity, where principles of human rights and democracy and self-determination can flourish. So we've got to think about, and you could add a bunch of other principles to that as well, but we've got to think about a constitutional architecture or a form of peacemaking that is an alternative to the one that you've so thoroughly debunked. You list 3 or 4 of them, but give us a couple of them to kind of, we're a solutions-oriented community here at the Conduit, so give us a source of optimism.
Wow, no, you didn't warn me beforehand. So, I mean, one thing we really avoid doing in the book is offering a blueprint or prescription, and for many reasons, but one of the main reasons is we were associated with a two-state solution, so I don't know why anyone would buy anything from us this time. So we're not, and if Hussein, and I wish he were here, he's much more entertaining than I am, you should have him at some point, but he would be extremely opposed to even starting to contemplate, let's think of the best possible outcome. What we'd say in the book is this notion that the only solution is a two-state solution. How many times did I not only hear that, how many times did I have to write it when I was writing for the presidents that I served? And that's hogwash, right? I mean, of course there are other solutions. I mean, I'm not sure, it depends how you define solution. One is the status quo. I mean, it's been the most sustainable of quote-unquote unsustainable outcomes that one could imagine. It's been at least 20 years that I've heard, and again, that I've written in the name of secretaries of state or presidents, that the status quo is unsustainable, it's going to, well, you know what? Give me a status quo that's this unsustainable. Many people, the Israelis would take it, right? That's what they'd say. Yeah, 30 years is long enough and we could go another 30. So if you ask me what I think is the most likely outcome, unfortunately, it is something resembling where we are now, only worse. So that's one outcome. There are worse outcomes, forms of ethnic cleansing, which could occur. Obviously, some Israelis were flirting with it. One American president was flirting with it at some point. And then there are others, right? There are other outcomes that are not necessarily based on this ethno-national partition of land, which, again, I mean, we could talk more about what were the fallacies of the two-state solution, but part of it was this notion, security was for one and self-determination was for the other, but what about security for the Palestinians? And anyway, I could go on and on about where it was, even in its best format, it wasn't really responsive to what people would consider to be two states. But there are other options of confederation, of federation, of loose. I would summarize them as a looser, more porous definition of borders. Again, we were talking about it earlier. What can you imagine in terms of responding to just two challenges that I would put to anyone? One is the question of the refugees, right? I mean, how do you deal with the millions of refugees, hundreds of thousands of whom may want to come back, in a way that addresses Palestinian aspirations and yearnings, but that is not viewed as threatening to Israelis? That's number one. Number two, what do you do now with the 700,000 Israeli settlers, if you count East Jerusalem? I don't know what the number is exactly, but it's somewhere in those. You're going to ask all of them to leave, force all of them to leave, most of them to leave. So those two, just those two, I could talk about Jerusalem, I could talk about other issues, but just those two issues, how do you fit them in the sort of small, narrow confines of a strict ethno-national partition? It doesn't, again, putting aside the fact that, as I said, it doesn't really respond to the historic yearnings that animated the Zionist movement or the historic yearnings that animated the Palestinian national movements, which are really movements about identity, and you can't really divide or slice identity, or as Hussein once said to me when we were talking about this, you can't divide and slice up love, and they all love sort of both sides love what they identify as the expression of their national movement. So are there forms of confederation? Are there forms people have these ideas of vertical sovereignty, of mixed sovereignty, in which, for example, refugees could live anywhere in the land of Israel-Palestine but have Palestinian citizenship, and settlers could live in anywhere, or Israeli Jews could live anywhere but have Israeli citizenship? Again, I don't have an answer, and it would be preposterous for me to offer one, but the straitjacket of the two-state solution has impeded this kind of conversation, which Israelis and Palestinians, by the way, were having before the creation of the State of Israel. They were thinking of different answers. So I don't know. I mean, obviously, there's some people who believe in a binational state. I would love to see it. I'm very skeptical that a pure binational state is conceivable at this point, maybe sometime in the future. So our challenge is, it's really to Israelis and Palestinians, those who, and why do we call the book, we didn't talk about it, Tomorrow's Yesterday, but so much of what we're seeing today, if not everything, is a throwback to the past. And right now, where you have Israelis and Palestinians who don't share anything in terms of a vision, a destination, a sense of even what the conflict is about, they're going to have to, we hope that they will resume the kind of conversations they were having at the turn of the 20th century and after 1948, when the Palestinian movement was completely adrift and at a loss. Conversations between courageous Israelis and Palestinians to start of thinking about different pathways forward. I think we're at that point again.
So we're going to pivot to talk about Iran, but I wanted to just double down on that, because it's clear that if we all had the definitive reimagined constitutional settlement, firstly, it would probably be immediately discredited, and secondly, you'd need to go through a longer process to get there. But I think the part of your book, and we've had other panels and discussions at the Conduit, that has been most intellectually fertile, at least from my perspective, is to think about the solution less in the form of partition or what happened in the former Yugoslavia, what happened with India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and whatever, or to think of it in the form of South Africa, where it's one sovereign nation, and you get to that, but more akin to the way you think about the distribution of sovereignty between the European Union and its states, or the asymmetrical federalism that you see in Spain with the Basques and the Catalans and other forms of autonomous unit, which is to say you have land, you have an ability to reside and to move between it, you have areas of sovereignty which are about your security affairs that you retain, you have your foreign affairs that you retain, but you have some economic degrees of sovereignty, joint water, joint infrastructure, a good joint telco, interesting internet connections, common agricultural policy. You could begin to think of a way that divided up sovereignty in a way that created aggregate economic benefits, a sense of volition, and a sense of belonging in a way that people also kept what was sacred to them. Loads and loads of detail there, but I think for everybody in the audience, beginning to imagine it in that way, as improbable as it seems. You know, the Germans and the French were killing each other, and then suddenly they formed the European Union. And they started with coal and steel, and then they moved it onto other things. So I think that may be the path. How you get there is interesting. And
I completely agree with that. And again, to those who, and I still meet a number of them who say, as you just said, that sounds fantastical, we'll never get there. Yeah, but the fact is, people have tried now for decades to get to the two-state solution, and it's failed. So why would you continue down that path rather than try something different? Now, it also, and we spoke about it earlier, it will require different distribution of incentives and disincentives, and that's where there may be some hope from coming out of my country, because I do think there's a different awareness of America's role and what role it has played and not played in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, different moral awakening, at least among the young generation. So maybe the combination of that and of new thinking, maybe if we want to leave this part of the conversation on an optimistic note, that may be a recipe for something different.
Great. So having had a little flicker of optimism, now let's turn to Iran. So you literally were in the room and negotiated one of the most important disarmaments, arms control deals of our time in the form of the JCPOA. So have a deep sense of the relationship between Iran and its neighbors and the United States. So I want to start where we left off with October 7th. And leading from October 7th comes a series of Israeli actions, not just in Gaza, but also in relation to Iran, to say we've been threatened by Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iranians for a long period of time. Netanyahu takes his opportunity, attacks. The Iranians seem to respond in a small way, but seem humbled and look a little bit like a paper tiger. And then Trump does his 2 or 3 day nuclear neutering. And there is a move from that to where we are now. And I'd like you just to sort of tell us a little bit about how you get from October 7th to where we are now. Tell me your analysis of it, but also why it is that Trump and the Israelis did not leave their first military action, as it was, while they were negotiating in negotiations I'm sure you've been in Geneva, barely 48 hours after the military action. So it's a compound question. I apologize.
Yeah, no, and so I'll try to make the link between the two to the degree I can. In one way, it is, I mean, there is a through line from October 7th till what we're seeing now, which is wars of opportunity. And first war, Israel did feel genuinely under threat on October 7th, and what had happened was traumatic to every Israeli, no matter their politics, and no matter what their view is of how they got there. And then you have a situation where Israel is in a position to take out, one after the other, every entity, every movement, every state that it believed was threatening them, and had some connection to this axis of resistance, whatever it really amounts to. So the question is almost not why, but why not? Like if you're sitting in Israel and you think, this is our opportunity, we don't want to have to, deal with a dangerous Hezbollah in the future or Iran, if we have the opportunity now to really neutralize them and to, the expression mow the lawn, which I think at this point is not even appropriate, because they're not really mowing the lawn, they're pounding the sand and they're trying to prevent anything from growing ever again. That's a mentality which, again, if I want to quote President Obama, it would be irrational to think that was not going to happen. They had the opportunity, they did it. It may be, I would argue that it is not just unlawful, not just extremely immoral and dangerous, but I think it's going to be dangerous for long-term for Israel as well. But that's me thinking. I could see why, if you're a strategist in Israel and you're just looking at the map today, every target, it's as far and as hard as they can hit. Why not? So it's not, that part is not that surprising. I mean, in some ways, I think we could talk about October 7th. I'm convinced that this was not, and I think even the Israeli intelligence services now would agree, this was not a plan that was plotted between Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas. It really, at that point at least, was a Hamas decision. It may have been at some point discussed among all of them as something they could do, but Hamas sort of took the lead and did it without forewarning. And so Israel was in a position where it could then deal with each one separately as opposed to all of them at once. So I think that's, from an Israeli point of view, one could see the thread. But the other thread from an American point of view, and this is not, I'm not sure it's really responsive to your question, but I want to say it anyway. To the extent that there was, and we didn't speak too much about America's failure, even the people who were well-intentioned, who wanted to reach peace between Israelis and Palestinians, their failure to do so. There's so many reasons. But one of them is, I think, a truly failure to understand and to empathize with and to comprehend what animated the Palestinians. Clearly, the Americans, again, I don't think this is a state secret, were more comfortable with understood better the Israeli side for all kinds of reasons. The Palestinian side, they didn't really get. And there's some of the anecdotes we say in the book, but some that I could add here about how things that from a Palestinian perspective seem to be color, looked white, looked black in American eyes, concessions that the Palestinians thought were meaningful were viewed as meaningless by the Americans. I mentioned earlier the whole, idea of security for one and self-determination for the other, as if the Palestinians also didn't want security. From their perspective, they'd been the victims of one massacre after another, so yes, Israelis need security, but what about the Palestinians? Or the whole nomenclature of a generous offer, which says so much about, and this is how the Israeli offer at Camp David was described, a generous offer that will never see the light of day again, that the fact that it was an offer and that it was generous was so demeaning of the Palestinian position. But I think it was genuine on the part of even American officials who were not saying that out of bad intention, but out of lack of understanding. Fast forward to Iran, one of the most revealing things I think any Trump administration official has said from before the war till today was when the president's envoy, Steve Witkoff, said that the president was frustrated. He didn't understand why the Iranians didn't capitulate in the face of the Armada, knowing that if they didn't agree to the terms that the U.S. was demanding, they would face certain defeat. Again, I mean, I'm not saying that's the reason why we're at war, but I do think that at some level for the United States, and more for President Trump even than for his predecessors, there's this notion of we're going to give the parties an offer they can't refuse because the alternative is going to be that their hell is going to be made more hellish still. That was true of the Palestinians. We're going to tell them, if you don't accept this deal, look at the horror that you're going to live in. And to the Iranians, if you don't accept this deal, we might strike you. And again, I think human nature just doesn't function that way. By the way, as I say to American officials, we wouldn't function that way either if we were presented with that kind of choice. So there's much more to say about Iran, but I did want to make that connection.
So I want to ask the question about why the first strike, the precision strike of Americans in relation to nuclear facilities, the 12-day strikes by the Israelis, and in some ways Iran is humbled, the nuclear threat is or isn't, depending on who you believe, set back by X amount of period of time. But you could imagine that you achieved through strikes and military force what the JCPOA was seeking to do as an arms control agreement, and then you just go, leave it at that. And every time they get too close to this, we'll just do it again. Minimal cost, high rhetoric, it's effective. And then what you do is you do the fuller expression as if the Iranian response that it has regionalized the conflict, mined the Straits of Hormuz, put drones up in the way that they have, and all the ways in which they fought asymmetrically was not perfectly predictable. Like any sophisticated intelligence agency in the world, when you war game this out, I'm sure, without revealing.
Just ruled out the United States, but yeah.
But I'm saying, I'm sure when you were doing all these negotiations, you had scenario after scenario after scenario where you took certain things off the table because you followed the bounce of the ball, right? What happened here? Is it just Trump thinking that negotiations are a real estate deal and that, I bully you and you give in? Because the Iranian regime is just deeper and more sophisticated than Venezuela, and they're disanalogous. Tell us why this wasn't foreseeable.
I've said this enough over the last few weeks, but I think you could have a degree in, Iranian history, Middle East, be the nuclear expert, all of which I'm not, and you still wouldn't get the answer because this is a matter of President Trump, his psychology, and I'm not a Trumpologist, and so I can't claim that I could really answer that question. I could give my best guess. I think part of it is that how much he was emboldened, not just by Venezuela, although I think that did play a big part, because he faced all these festering problems. And I could get to I think it's a bipartisan responsibility, Democrat and Republican, for having left so many of these problems, hyping them like Iran is an existential threat, right? How many times did I hear, again, how many times did people write, maybe I wrote, at some points that presidents we serve, this is a threat. All options have to be on the table to be able to deal with it, including military options. So there's a normalization of the fact that Iran is the devil, Iran is a demon, and military force is an acceptable means of dealing with it. And so President Trump inherits that ecosystem, that sort of intellectual, political, conventional way of thinking, which is they're the devil, and what has Obama done? At best, he does a nuclear deal, which doesn't prevent them over time from developing a nuclear program. It leaves their missile program intact. It leaves their proxy network intact. So, of course, it's not the answer. And I could say the same about Venezuela. We left that fester. We maintain sanctions. We say that it's an evil regime, but we are not prepared to take any decisive steps one way or the other. So I think there's that. That's the permission slip in a way that the president has if he wants to go in that direction. You add to that, as I said, the fact that he's emboldened. Venezuela, magnificent success from his point of view. The killing of Qasem Soleimani in the first term, which people had thought, maybe this is going to lead to huge Iranian reaction. Very little. The moving the embassy to Jerusalem. A lot of experts said this is going to ignite protests and deadly protests among Palestinians and Muslims and Arabs. Not much. The strike against Fordo, same thing. The response from the Iranians was a pre-telechoreographed strike on American base in Qatar. So when I think that's sort of I believe that human emotions matter. When you're the president and you say all these experts had warned me against things that I shouldn't do because if I did them, the sky would fall. The sky didn't fall. In fact, I'm stronger, they're weaker. Why don't I continue? So I think that definitely was part of that. I think added to it, of course, I think there were voices, not too many, but very strong ones, some in the U.S., certainly the Prime Minister of Israel, saying, you could go down in history, Mr. President, as the person who has changed the face of the Middle East in a way that will be unrecognizable, because if the Iranian regime is either changed, toppled, or battered, bloodied, and no longer only a shadow of what it was, then the whole, everything changes in the Middle East, because we don't have any opponent. There's no adversary anymore. It's sort of, the sky's the limit. But not only that, and this maybe Netanyahu told him or others, start with Venezuela, one anti-American regime that is now in the America-friendly column. Do that to Iran. Next you do it in Cuba, and he will have resolved, in his mind, three of the most, aggravating problems that the U.S. has faced in terms of the alliance or these collection of governments that have been hostile. So I think all of that, and then, what the Iranians were offering, and I hear this now from everyone, they were offering at the negotiating table more than they offered Obama or Biden. Now, I wish they had offered us that, but they were prepared to do more and to reach a deal that was, quote unquote, superior to the JCPOA. And at one point I thought that would be enough for the president, because he could come out and say, thanks to my military pressure, thanks to the fact that I'm the master of deal making, I did better than Obama. And I thought that would be enough. But, the Iranians, they were not going to give everything away. They're not going to give everything away in a day in any event. But certainly they weren't going to move fast, and they weren't going to move as far as zero enrichment, which was at some point, it seemed, the American goal. that I think when the president was presented with the notion of negotiations that are going to last some time, maybe they'll get a deal, the deal will be better than the JCPOA on technical terms, or a quick fix, I'm going to go after this regime. He must have thought that it was going to be easier, shorter, with less of a response by Iran than he's witnessed. He chose the latter.
Okay, so now let's talk about where we are, because let's say it looks as though we may be in a week or two looking like we took the crystal ball and looked at it in the wrong way. But it looks as though this is a big and significant miscalculation, that regime change hasn't happened from the skies, that the new regime and the replacement to the Ayatollah, being his son, is just as battle-hardened as his father, if not more, that the Revolutionary Guard has dispersed itself and there hasn't been an uprising on the streets, and that the Strait of Hormuz and $110, $120, $130 a barrel is going to start making Trump get a bit queasy in terms of how long he wants to continue this. So tell us what you think is this is an impossible question, the most likely outcome in the next month, and then when the dust settles, how it reconfigures power, because the bet was it would reconfigure power in a way that was friendly to the United States and helpful to Israel. If it turns out that that's a historic miscalculation, there will be some, we're living in the most historic of all times.
Yeah, so first I'll say, I'm very worried about the next phases of the war, partly because of this unpredictable actor, and the unpredictable actor is not, Orientalists would say, or some would say, the unpredictable, fanatical, personality-driven politics is in Iran, and the more institutionalized, predictable, rational politics is in the U.S., and it's exactly the opposite in this case. So, and I do also fear, and I don't say this lightly, that we now have in President Trump somebody who it's not my cup of tea, I would admit that, but I never thought was the most dangerous in terms of foreign policy because I believed some of what he said, that he was against these long-term entanglements, these stupid wars, these endless wars. But you do have now the marriage, the convergence of bottomless immorality and infinite power. And that's, to me, that because he sees these toys in front of him, and I don't know what next toy he will feel if he's frustrated. If he thinks that this is not ending the way he wants, will he decide to, the way they speak about this war is really like a video game, and that just really worry me in terms of what it will do to the Iranian people. But putting that aside, if we can, over the next month, I assume at some point the president will will declare victory. The one benefit of his having given us, 1,000 different objectives for this war, every day it changes, no, every hour it changes, is that at some point he will find one of those 1,000 objectives, say that it was met and say that it was always the objective he was trying to pursue, and call it quits and say, I won this war, I killed the Ayatollah, I re-obliterated their nuclear program, I completely degraded their missile program, their drone program is not what it was, and by the way, if they even lift a finger and try to reconstitute any of the above, I could strike them again. Goodbye, I'm leaving. That's assuming that he's master of the clock, both of when he begins the war, that he was, but also when he ends it. And, the Iranians may be of a different mind, because what I'm hearing, indirectly from them, and maybe they're just saying it because they want to project this, is you don't get to decide when this ends, because, number one, we have, there's the counts we need to settle, but secondly, maybe more important, is that what they don't want is for the lesson to be, we get away with it again, and maybe we could get away with it once again when we decide to strike. So I think the lesson they've learned from the last 2 years plus, which have not been, from an Iranian perspective, very good years, and they're going to have a lot of reckoning to do, because almost all of their strategic calculations have turned out to be failures. Their nuclear program, even their missile program, their regional alliances, Russia, China, nothing has really panned out the way they might have thought. But they do have this ability to inflict real costs on the world economy and therefore on President Trump. And I suspect in the back of their mind is, we need to teach them a lesson that if they do this again, there's going to be real hell to pay. We haven't made them pay quite enough. So they may continue. But my last point about long-term consequences, and tomorrow is yesterday, the history is replete, the region is replete of lessons of history, of where initial military triumphs turn out to be long-term nightmares and to backfire. And you could think of the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, Israel's invasion of South Lebanon, the killing of the predecessor of Nasrallah. I mean, one case after another where what appears to be a short-term military victory is a long-term strategic failure. And so I don't know where we'll be a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, but what I can say, why we do say tomorrow's yesterday, is that memories are not going to go quiet. And there are now a large number of Palestinians, of Lebanese, of Iranians who have nothing to lose because they've lost everything. And that's a very dangerous recipe for the future. Now, hopefully there are ways to prevent it, but it's not as if this ends and people go on and forget. They remember.
So I want to come to just the way we think about the theory of so if Trump miscalculated and there is a theory of change that, this Shah's son would come back in, or some Venezuelan less, a more palatable alternative connected with the regime but is not going to cause us difficulty, of all the different scenarios, let alone a democratically elected popular leader. If that turns out to be wrong and the Revolutionary Guard and the Ayatollah's son now become empowered, and we've banned, what we haven't done is address, the kind of fundamental thing that, let's not forget, this is a regime which in the last 3 or 4 months has butchered its own people. Tens of thousands of people have died when they rose up, arguably. We don't have the exact numbers, but when history looks at this, it will be tens of thousands of people, one of the worst sets of massacres ever. What's your prognosis for a possible regime change despite this action, right? Is there a scenario where you actually have a different regime that comes into power, that when the dust settles, disaffection amongst the Bazaris or other groups or the Kurds or others say, look, Trump may be a maniac, but until we have an alternative, we're just going to be consistently facing these aggressions and military strikes?
Listen, I have no doubt that this is a regime that has lost whatever legitimacy it had domestically. It failed economically, it failed socially, and it failed even in terms of what was its main selling point, which it was going to provide security and safety through its arsenal, military arsenal, nuclear program, and proxy network, and all of those have failed. So I do think that it is not a regime that has the kind of domestic support that it would need to last in theory. Now, does the war give it more of a lease on life? Does it consolidate the regime? Does it sort of quiet down some of the internal rumblings that might have existed, at least at the elite level? Possibly. Does it empower those, the IRGC in particular, that appear to be in the driver's seat? Possibly. But at some point, no, I don't, and I don't know after the dust settles, I'm not going to predict this. At some point, I do think there's going to be a transformation, because it just cannot respond. It cannot address. And it's not a society, it's not like North Korea, I think, a society that can live in that kind of deprivation for that long. So I do think it's gonna face, and by the way, even without the war, the protests that you mentioned, the time span between protests was getting shorter and shorter, and the protests were getting broader and broader. I mean, that if you go back from the early 2000s to today. So there is a real crisis, a political crisis in Iran. I don't think this was the way, obviously, as I said earlier, and I'll say it again, it was unlawful, it was unjustified and unnecessary war. But I think this war may have done the exact opposite in terms of does it lead to the kind of change that so many Iranians want? I don't know, because we'll have to see. I suspect in the short term there's going to be consolidation. I don't know. Again, once the dust settles and the war is no longer what people are focused on, how does the leadership respond to the problems which now have been multiplied because the country has been, so much of the infrastructure would have been destroyed. So it's really going to be a challenge. But again, one thing I've learned from being in government is even the people who claim to have all of this knowledge always get it wrong. I mean, they obviously didn't predict the Arab uprisings at all, not in Egypt, not in Tunisia, not in Libya, not in Yemen. Then when the outbreak when it happened in Syria, they thought, oh, now all these other regimes have fallen, Syria will fall right away. 13 years later, it was still standing. And then on the eve of the Assad falling, the Americans, the administration was thinking of normalizing with Syria because Assad wasn't going anywhere. So I'm not going to try to be more of a predictor than those who are paid a lot of money to get it wrong.
So we're going to turn over to the audience, but I want to ask you a very final question about America, because in your book, you save some of the most scathing criticism for the role of the United States. And I kind of want to ask this question about America's role in the world now that we've had Trump, Biden, Trump, and a kind of what I sense is, I don't want to use the word irreversible, but a profound shift in the moral capital of America as a good faith party. And you sort of say it's, in your book, almost sort of not taking into account Trump. You say, America played a particular role in these negotiations where it, sided with the wrong players, was uninformed, wasn't perhaps constructive or helpful. But it occurred against a backdrop where I don't think anybody said that President Obama wasn't trying to do the right thing, not just by America, but by a certain conception of America being a good citizen in the world order. A flawed world order, a world order that lots of people might critique, but there's something that I think we can't let pass, which is, are we now existing in an era where America will take 25 years or 50 years, if ever, to rebadge itself as a good faith player in global affairs with Europeans in the Middle East, with Latin Americans, Africans? And what are the consequences of that rebadging of America? So one, do you accept that premise? And B, where does that leave us in thinking about the role of America? Historically, we've thought of it as, at least some people, as sort of standing for democracy and human rights, despite its track record.
I want to meet those people. I was going to start by saying, I think there may have been an overly idealized vision by some. I'm not sure who, but I travel a lot around the world. I'm not sure that the moral capital of the U.S. was that as high as maybe some people may believe. And I come from a generation where we've seen what the U.S. did, whether it's in Vietnam or in Iraq or in Afghanistan or even
South Africa.
Or even President Obama, who I served in, for whom I have a lot of admiration. But the counterterrorism war, the drone warfare, there's a lot that one could say about that is not particularly positive. So I think that moral capital, or whatever it was that the U.S. enjoyed, was already very seriously on the decline. I think it was, these declines, powers like the U.S. by definition decline at some point. I think there are some accelerators. The Iraq war was one accelerator. I think the other accelerator is President Trump, first term and now second. Those are accelerators in terms of people sort of having a different image of the United States. Now, I just want to leave it with this thought, because I am here in Europe. In the recent Munich conference and Davos conference, one was hearing voices of Europeans and of the Canadian Prime Minister, who gave a pretty remarkable speech in which he said, not just that we need to think of a different order because the U.S. is shredding it, but also recognizing the fact that international liberal order was not that morally fair to all parties, and that depending on what side you were, you got treated quite differently. And yet, the first test with this war in Iran, where was that moral awareness? I don't like to think of myself, but I'm a cynic at this point. But even with all my cynicism, I would not have expected to hear those people. I don't even know how, I actually don't understand how they wrote the speeches they wrote, when they were all saying, we need to think of a new order in which middle powers and others are going to stand up for something that is more consistent and virtuous and less duplicitous and less hypocritical, in which the global south could identify with more. And then you have a war that not a single serious legal scholar could call justified or legal in any way, which on its first day caused the death of 170 school children. And where were those voices? So the real answer to your question would be, I'm still waiting to see what the alternative will be. I don't assume that even if you will have a different U.S. president at some point, and it will not have all of the excesses of the Trump administration. I still think we are in the midst of a real transformation of the world order. But again, this first test, after they failed the test of Gaza with flying colors, this was the second test, which was a test that came after the Greenland scare. So what it appears to, I think, for most outsiders, it's, when it's about Europe and Greenland and a possible, not even actual, but a possible illegal invasion, that will get us to rise up. But if it's an actual war, a war of choice, a war of opportunity, and a legal war, but it's out in Iran, a regime we don't like, and I understand that there's no reason to like it, but still, either you apply the norms or you don't. And so I leave it with that thought. I think if you really want to rethink the world order, then some of the countries that claim that we're going to be the champions of a more moral one need to take a hard look in the mirror.
Try harder.
Or give it up.
All right, I'm going to turn over to you. I'm genuinely going to implore you to ask a question, not make a speech. So please put your hands up and we'll recognize you. And there's somebody in the back corner.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. You mentioned a couple of times the changing public opinion of American citizens on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Do you have any thoughts on what caused that change, given it seems to have predated October 7th, firstly? And secondly, I guess, how long does it take for that to actually filter into a change policy, and what's the mechanism by which that happens?
That's a great question. Take one at a time? So it has been going on for some time. I mean, I think younger generations, their image of Israel, they didn't grow up with Israel being the David facing the Goliath. They saw a series of wars in which they were not particularly comfortable with the way Israel was waging it. I think there was a great identification with the Palestinians. I do think that what happened after October 7th sort of both magnified and accelerated it. And so if you look at the polling, it is, and I'm not always a huge believer in polls, but it is quite striking, not just among Democrats, where there you could understand that it's, identification with the underdog, their sense of justice, of morality. They don't understand how the Palestinians could be treated the way they are. It also intersects with some other movements in the U.S. about, Black Lives Matter and others. So I think it all came at a time. I think what is in some ways more, I don't know if it's more interesting, but perhaps more striking is what's happening on parts of the Trump Republican base, the MAGA constituency. Now, for most of them, I wouldn't say that it's because they have empathy or sympathy for the Palestinians. I think it comes very much from a American-centric view, is why should we be providing funds to a country that has pretty comfortable GDP, and why should we be allying ourselves with a country that is dragging us into wars that we have nothing to do with? And that's Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon and others. And the convergence of the two does mean that the numbers are now moving in a pretty extraordinary direction. Now, you asked the right question, which is, how and when does this translate politically? Now, what that requires is for the attention to stay focused on Israel-Palestine. It may not be. It requires it to be one of the top issues on which people are going to vote, because they may care about it, but they care about 10 things more than that, and ultimately they're going to choose their candidate not based on that candidate's position on Israel-Palestine, but on a host of other things. So I don't want to sound, and the third thing that may modulate the shift is you will have a different Israeli government at some point. It won't be led by Netanyahu. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich won't be a part of it. The war in Gaza will be more in the rearview mirror, and at that point, I could imagine American politicians, Democrats in particular, saying, well, we dodged a bullet. Now we could deal with a more sensible Israel, even though that Israel is not going to do anything to truly end the occupation or provide the Palestinians with their legitimate rights. So I look at all of that, and I don't know where it ends, but again, we were talking about it earlier, the fact that you now have middle-of-the-road Democratic politicians who are saying they would not accept any money from AIPAC. That, if you had said that to me, I don't know, a year ago, 2 years ago, I would have thought you were crazy. I mean, that was never, I don't know how many of you are Americans, but that's sort of one of those taboos that I didn't think was going to be slayed. But so you have very, very prominent mainstream American politicians saying they won't accept money from AIPAC, who are describing Israel as an apartheid state, who are speaking about conditioning military assistance to Israel. So that has become now, it's hard, a Democrat has to look over his or her shoulder if they don't say those things. So things are changing. I just don't know how soon. Money also has to change as well. But how soon does that translate into people voting on the basis of a politician's position on those issues?
Thank you. Sorry. I'd just like to take it from a different angle, national security. You may be familiar with components called rare earths, like iridium and rhodium, for example, which are in every major high-tech product like mobile phones and cars, electric car batteries. So China controls 90% of the supply of those components, and they declared an embargo recently which sent panic through major world companies. So if you add the Venezuelan oil supply and the Iranian oil supply, that's 20% of China's oil supply. So I wonder if that's affecting Trump because he sees that he can have some sort of pressure on China to counterweight the Chinese control of rare earths.
It's a great question. I don't have a good answer. I mean, the president himself has said that he wants to do a favor to China, and that the oil from Venezuela can still be sold to China, that even he said he wants the Strait of Hormuz to remain open, and he's saying that's also a favor to China. Whether he's also thinking about that, I can't speculate what's in his mind. I don't know how effective that would be because there are other oil suppliers, and I don't know the answer, but I would be surprised if that were a driving force, and I'd be surprised if it works. Although it is clear that the president himself seems obsessed by this notion of taking over other people's oil. I mean, he's very open about it, and he's been open about it since the Iraq War when he said, other than the fact that he at some point said it was a stupid war, he said at a minimum we should have taken the oil. So he does have this very transactional, materialistic, predatory view of natural resources and of oil in particular. So it could be.
Thank you very much indeed. I have a copy on my bookcase of Larry Bond's Persian Incursion, which, of course, although it's in theory a board game, is in fact very much more than that. My question is, if Iran's nuclear program was genuinely peaceful, where are the nuclear power stations? Because people seem to be ignoring the concept of the bomb in the basement, where all the factors are ready, but they just haven't put them together. And I heard somebody at the weekend say in a webinar that the Ayatollah, before he was killed, had said Iran will never have nuclear weapons. Well, that lady seems not to understand that people lie. And I understand in Islam, it is allowed to lie to non-believers. It's not considered morally wrong.
So I'll give him a straightforward answer. Do I think that Iran's nuclear program was based on civilian needs? No. It was not a logical. If that was their goal, they would not have built it the way they did. As you say, where were the reactors? They were enriching at levels that were not justified by a civilian nuclear program. So I've never argued that, take them at their word. But there was a deal, the JCPOA, which would have ensured at a minimum that for 10 years Iran could not try to develop a bomb without being detected way ahead of time. And then if they're detected, you decide what you're going to do. I'm not going to speculate as to what the right answer would be, but at least you would know. And they were not in a position to rush to a bomb. They certainly were not in a position to rush to a bomb after the 12-day war, right? And based on what I'm hearing from people who were in the negotiating room, the Iranians, as I said earlier, were prepared to sign on to a deal that was more restrictive, more constraining than the JCPOA. So I don't, if the concern is nuclear, which I could understand it, they were diplomatic means of addressing it. And I think, you know, I've always been convinced, I try to put myself in other people's shoes. If I was an Iranian leader, yeah, I probably would like a bomb. I mean, I look around the world, I look at a few countries, North Korea, Libya, and Iraq. What happened to Iraq? It didn't have a nuclear weapon, didn't have a nuclear bomb, it got invaded. What happened to Libya? They gave up the nuclear program, they get invaded, the leader gets assassinated, killed. What happens in North Korea? They have a bomb, nobody's bothering them. So, yeah, I think if the Ayatollah, you know, he did have a fatwa, but I think if he felt that he could, within a day or two or a week, get a bomb, you know, he'd be sorely tempted. He can't. They were at least, and these are the most pessimistic or optimistic, depending on where you stand, estimates 6 months to a year. If they had a crash program, it would have been detected, I suspect. And now I'm sure it would have been detected because we've seen how much Israel had managed to penetrate Israel. I mean, knew everything. So I take your point. I'm not naive. I don't think that they were doing it because they wanted to, you know, maybe they do also want to have civilian nuclear power, but they were doing it as a hedge. They wanted to be a threshold nuclear state. That was their goal. And in particular, they wanted to use it as leverage to try to get what they wanted, but also get the sanctions lifted. But, you know, if past this precedent, they were prepared to make a deal that would have at least given confidence that they were not going to try to do it, or they couldn't do it undetected.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. It's been really interesting. I wanted to ask a question about how the kind of ongoing conflict maps onto conflict resolution elsewhere in the world, particularly Russia, Ukraine, seeing where we can kind of understand what the impact of ongoing conflict in the Middle East is having on that in terms of kind of distracting Trump potentially from negotiations in that space, and also whether, you know, Iran obviously being knocked out as part of kind of a Russian ally, whether that's a kind of net positive, a net negative, sorry, for Russia, or whether, you know, we see these oil prices spiking and what that means for Putin and the conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, it's another good question. I think it shows where the president's priorities are. They're definitely not in Ukraine. I mean, it is a distraction. They're now giving more allowances for countries to buy Russian oil. The price of oil has gone up. The U.S. is expending a lot of its munitions on another war. It's had to move some of its interceptors and other military systems to the Gulf. So on that level, I think Putin probably thinks, why not? I don't know how much he likes, to your point, the fact that Syria, Venezuela, now Iran are the victims, at least in his mind, of Western attempts to turn them away from Russia. You know, I don't think he believes the regime is going to fall. I think he could read the map probably better than President Trump could, and he thinks it's going to survive in a weakened state. But I don't think they're panicking over that. And I think China in particular, you know, for them, this is a long game, and their priority is in their geographic space. This is not bad for them in terms of where the U.S. is pivoting. After having spent decades saying we're going to pivot to Asia, they're clearly pivoting back if they ever left to the Middle East. I'm not an expert on China. I've always wondered, is this a moment where China might attempt something on Taiwan? People who follow it tell me, no, they can't. They're not in a position to do so. But if they were in a position to do so, when the U.S. is so distracted and has moved so much of its equipment to the Gulf, it wouldn't be a bad time. So I think Russia and China don't, you know, I'm not sure how much they like the fact that the U.S. is doing this because of what it means about the relative power. But in the long term, seeing the U.S. yet again embroiled in a meaningless conflict in the Middle East, expending resources, expending moral capital, may not be the worst thing, particularly if the regime survives, which at this point it looks like it will.
With that, I'm afraid we have to end. Rob is going to be signing books. They are for sale. As this conversation illustrates, a more astute, thoughtful, honest and reflective scholar you will not find in many places. So I think I'm enormously grateful for the depth of your insight, for your service You have led the International Crisis Group, which is a great friend of the Conduit and many exceptional people in that institution. And so I'm so grateful for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you.